I can still feel the weight of the silence at the dinner table the night I announced my major. It was my 18th birthday. Mark had just received a summer internship at a prestigious firm in London, and the air was thick with celebration. My father had been holding a wine glass, swirling a deep red liquid. He paused, the glass hovering mid-air. "Historical what?" he asked, his voice flat. "Linguistics," I repeated, my own voice sounding small. "The study of how languages change over time." My mother forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, that's interesting, dear. What kind of job does one get with that?" The question hung in the air, not out of genuine curiosity but as a judgment. Mark snorted into his napkin. "What are you going to do, Anya? Get a job talking to ghosts?" The table erupted in polite, cutting laughter. I remember looking down at the gift they'd given me, a delicate, expensive watch, and feeling like it was a timer, counting down the moments until I disappointed them completely. That night set the tone for the next 8 years of my life. Every family gathering became a fresh opportunity for them to highlight my perceived failure. At Christmas, my father would loudly ask Mark for stock tips while asking me if I'd found any interesting vowels lately. At my college graduation, while Mark's graduation party had been a catered affair at a country club, mine was a tense dinner where my mother spent the evening telling her friends I was finding myself, and that my degree was more of a hobby really. The insults weren't always overt. More often they were quiet, passive-aggressive acts of dismissal. I remember one specific birthday, my 23rd. I had spent months working on a special gift for my father. Using the skills I was learning, I had found a collection of Old English poems from an obscure 14th century manuscript, translated them myself, and then learned bookbinding to present them in a hand-stitched leather volume. I was so proud of it. At the party, Mark of course stole the show. He presented our father with the keys to a vintage sports car, a gleaming silver machine that had everyone gasping and applauding. Then it was my turn. I handed my father the small, carefully wrapped book. He opened it, a polite smile fixed on his face. He glanced at the cover, flipped through a single page and then set it aside on the gift table with a cursory, "That's very creative, Anya." "Thank you." Later that evening I saw the book, my heart's work, being used as a coaster for a sweating glass of champagne. No one ever mentioned it again. It was a clear, unspoken message. Your effort, your passion, your world, it has no currency here. It is worthless. There was one person, however, who didn't see it that way. My grandfather, Arthur. He was my father's father, but they were cut from entirely different cloths. While my father was a man of concrete and steel, Arthur was a man of wind and dust and distant horizons. He had been an explorer in his youth, a collector of stories and oddities. His house was a museum of a life lived with wide-eyed wonder. It smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco and beeswax. Maps of places that no longer existed covered the walls, and shelves overflowed with artifacts. Sumerian clay tablets, Viking brooches, and most importantly to me, books. Hundreds of them in languages I'd never heard of. He was the one who planted the seed of my passion. When I was a little girl, instead of reading me fairy tales, he would show me the elegant script of Old Norse runes or the looping grace of Sanskrit. He taught me that a language wasn't just a set of words. It was the DNA of a culture, a ghost that carried the thoughts and dreams of people long gone. He saw the world not as a balance sheet, but as a tapestry of incredible interwoven stories. He was the only one who celebrated my choice of major. When I told him, his eyes lit up. "Ah, historical linguistics," he boomed, his voice raspy. "A fine choice. A noble choice. You're not just learning about the past, my girl, you're learning to listen to it." He became my academic confidant. He would send me postcards from his travels, always with a phrase written in a local dialect, challenging me to decipher it. He even funded a summer trip for me to the Pyrenees Mountains, to a small village where a unique variant of the Occitan language had once been spoken. This wasn't just any dialect. It was a linguistic island, a version of Old Occitan that had developed in near-total isolation in a single valley, the Val d'Aran, during a 50-year period in the 12th century. It had unique grammatical structures and vocabulary found nowhere else. It was a historical footnote, a whisper in the grand chorus of language, and I was fascinated by it. My grandfather had, on one of his expeditions decades ago, acquired what was believed to be one of the only surviving codices written in this specific dialect, a personal journal of a 12th century troubadour. It was his most prized possession. He let me study it, handle its delicate vellum pages. We would spend hours together in his dusty study, him with his pipe, me with my books, painstakingly deciphering the troubadour's verses. He would often look over at me and smile. "They don't see it, Anya," he'd say, gesturing vaguely in the direction of my parents' world. "They look for value in all the wrong places. They look for gold, but they miss the dragon's hoard right under their noses. Remember that. The most valuable things are often the ones everyone else has forgotten." When my grandfather passed away at the age of 89, it felt like the last light in my world had been extinguished. My family, of course, went through the motions of grief. My mother planned a funeral that was tasteful, well-attended, and emotionally sterile. My father gave a eulogy that sounded more like a business summary of Arthur's life than a tribute to a parent. Mark stood by his side, looking somber and responsible. I could see their minds were already elsewhere, calculating, anticipating. They were thinking about the will. Arthur had been a shrewd investor despite his eccentricities, and his fortune was considerable. My own grief was a quiet, heavy stone in my chest. I had lost the only person who had ever truly seen me. The day of the will reading felt cold and formal. We gathered in the mahogany-paneled conference room of his longtime lawyer, a kind, elderly man named Mr. Henderson. The air was thick with a tense, greedy anticipation that was barely concealed by black mourning clothes. My parents and Mark sat together on one side of the large table, a united front of expectation. I sat on the other, feeling small and alone. Mr. Henderson began to read. The initial bequests were classic Arthur. He left his extensive collection of antique doorknobs to my Aunt Clara, who had once complained about a sticky door. He left a lifetime supply of his favorite brand of orange marmalade to my father, a nod to a childhood joke. He left his prized collection of first-edition science fiction novels to Mark, who hadn't read a book for pleasure in a decade. My family shifted in their seats, their polite smiles tightening. This was all charming, but it wasn't the point. They were waiting for the real meat of it. The stocks, the properties, the serious assets. Mr. Henderson cleared his throat, peering over his spectacles at the document before him. "And now," he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "we come to the matter of the bulk of Arthur's estate." A collective, almost imperceptible lean-in from my family. This was it. The moment of truth. My father sat a little straighter. Mark subtly adjusted his tie. My mother's hand rested on my father's arm, a gesture of shared victory. "Arthur was a man of particular methods," Mr. Henderson continued, a slight knowing curve to his lips. "As such, the final instructions regarding his primary assets, his investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and offshore accounts, are not contained within this formal will." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. A confused silence filled the room. My father frowned. "What do you mean, Henderson? Where are they?" The lawyer reached into his briefcase and retrieved a large, sealed manila envelope. It was heavy and, from the crinkling sound, filled with loose papers. "They are here," he said, placing it on the polished table. In his own hand. Arthur stipulated that the final section of his testament was to be read directly from his personal journals. He broke the seal and carefully slid out a stack of aged, yellowed pages, covered in my grandfather's familiar spidery scrawl. The ink was faded, the handwriting a chaotic mix of cursive and print. The family stared at the pages, their confusion morphing into visible frustration. "This is absurd," my father finally said, his voice tight with annoyance. He was senile. "This can't be legally binding." "Oh, it is perfectly legal," Mr. Henderson assured him calmly. "I had it verified. However, there is a complication." He slid the top page across the table. My father, mother, and Mark all leaned over it. I could see their faces contort in disbelief. The script was utterly alien to them. It wasn't English. It wasn't any language they had ever seen. The letters were a beautiful, intricate dance on the page, but to them they were just meaningless squiggles. "What in God's name is this?" Mark asked, his voice sharp with anger. He looked at the lawyer as if he were to blame. "It's a joke. A final, senile joke from a crazy old man." My father was pale, his composure cracking. "So the location of his entire fortune is hidden in this gibberish?" Mr. Henderson nodded slowly. "Precisely. And per his instructions, The estate remains frozen until these passages are fully and accurately translated. While they descended into a quiet, furious panic, I felt a strange calm wash over me. I stared at the page from across the table. I didn't need to get closer. I recognized it instantly. The unique ligatures, the specific diacritical marks, the cadence of the phrasing I could almost hear in my head. It was the troubadour's dialect. The nearly extinct 12th century Occitan from the Val d'Aran. The language my grandfather and I had shared in the quiet of his study. And in that moment, sitting in a room full of people who had spent years making me feel worthless, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just sadness for my grandfather's loss. It was understanding. And it felt a little like power. The week that followed was a masterclass in controlled chaos. My family, accustomed to solving every problem by either throwing money at it or leveraging their connections, found themselves utterly stonewalled. The polished veneer of the successful, unflappable family cracked and splintered under the pressure. My father, David, was on the phone constantly, his voice growing more strained with each call. He brought in a renowned professor of Romance languages from the local university. The professor, a stuffy man with a tweed jacket, spent an hour peering at a scanned copy of the first page through a magnifying glass. He declared it a fascinating but unidentifiable patois, possibly a pidgin with Germanic influences, and charged them a $2,000 consultation fee for his expert-level confusion. Next, Mark, ever the pragmatist, decided it must be a code. He hired a private firm of cryptographers, two intense-looking young men who usually worked on corporate espionage cases. They ran the text through every decryption algorithm they had. They analyzed letter frequency, word patterns, and contextual clues. After 2 days they came back defeated. "It's not a cipher," the lead cryptographer said, shaking his head. "It's a real language. An incredibly obscure one. And combined with the highly idiosyncratic handwriting, it's beyond our scope." My mother, Carol, was having a quiet, simmering meltdown. Her concern wasn't just the money, it was the optics. The story of the eccentric Will was beginning to leak into their social circle. She imagined the whispers at the country club, the pitying looks from her friends. "This is humiliating," she hissed at my father during a tense dinner. "Your father has made us a laughingstock." I watched all of this from the periphery, a silent observer in my own home. They barely spoke to me, too consumed by their frantic, fruitless search. They had copies of the pages spread out on their dining room table like a battle map, staring at them with a mixture of greed and fury. I would walk past, catching snippets of their arguments. "We should contest the will," my father would thunder. "On what grounds?" Mark would shoot back, his voice dripping with condescension. "That Dad's dad was smarter than you? The lawyer said it's ironclad." I let them stew. I let them exhaust every possible avenue. It was a cruel thing to do perhaps, but a small, hard part of me, a part that had been chipped away at by years of their dismissal, felt that they deserved to feel this powerlessness, this frustration of staring at something valuable that they simply could not comprehend. Finally, after a full week of failure, their desperation reached its peak. I found them in the living room, the atmosphere heavy and defeated. My father was staring into the fireplace, my mother was twisting a handkerchief in her hands, and Mark was pacing back and forth like a caged tiger. This was my moment. I took a deep breath and stepped into the room. "I've been looking at the scans," I said, my voice quiet but clear. 3 pairs of eyes snapped towards me, filled with irritation as if I were a servant interrupting an important meeting. "What is it, Anya?" my father asked, his tone weary. "I think I can read it." The silence that followed was profound. It was a silence filled with utter, dismissive disbelief. Then Mark let out a short bark-like laugh. You can read it?" "Anya, the experts, the professors, the codebreakers, they couldn't even identify it. What makes you think you can do anything?" "Because it's not just a language," I said, my voice gaining strength. "It's a specific dialect. A variant of Old Occitan from the Val d'Aran, spoken for only a few decades in the 12th century. Grandfather Arthur had one of the only known books written in it. He taught it to me." My mother stared at me, her expression a mixture of confusion and pity. "Oh, Anya, darling," she said, her voice syrupy sweet, the way it always was when she was about to be particularly cruel. "That's a lovely story. One of your grandfather's little games. But this is the real world. This is about millions of dollars. We don't have time for your little hobbies. The word hobby struck me like a physical blow, but this time it didn't make me shrink. It made me angry. My hobby, as you call it, is the only key you have, I said, my eyes locking with hers. You've tried everything else. You've tried money and influence and so-called experts. They've all failed. So what have you got to lose by letting me try? My father looked from me to Mark, a flicker of something, not hope but sheer bottom-of-the-barrel desperation, in his eyes. Mark scoffed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. This is ridiculous. It's a waste of time. But my father raised a hand. Let her, he said, his voice grim. Let her try. As she said, what do we have to lose? It wasn't a vote of confidence. It was an act of final resort, the last pathetic long shot before admitting total defeat. Mark grudgingly emailed me the high-resolution scans of the journal pages. There was no please or thank you. The email was blank, just the attachments. The message was clear. Here, play with your little toys. Just don't get in the way of the adults. I opened the files on my laptop in my small, cluttered apartment. Unlike the sterile opulence of my parents' house, my space was a sanctuary of my own making. Bookshelves overflowed, spilling onto the floor. Maps of ancient trade routes were tacked to the walls. And in the center of it all, on a small wooden desk, sat the few precious books my grandfather had left directly to me in the first part of his will. His reference books on medieval dialects, including a facsimile of the very codex these pages came from. The world of my family, the shouting, the panic, the greed, melted away. Here, in the quiet company of these forgotten words, I was home. I was powerful. I began to translate. The first few pages were not instructions or lists of assets. They were a letter. A letter written from my grandfather to the future, to whoever would be reading it. But as I read, I realized he had written it for one person. He had written it for me. He wrote about his life, his adventures, his belief that true value was never loud or shiny. They will look for a map, he had written, his handwriting shaky but clear. Asterisk, they will expect a ledger. They think of this as a prize to be won. They do not understand that the real treasure is the ability to read the map itself. Asterisk, he wrote about my father, his son, with a deep and abiding sadness. Asterisk, I gave David every advantage, every tool to build a kingdom of wealth. But in his pursuit of building walls he forgot how to open doors. He sees the world in numbers but has lost the poetry of it. Asterisk, he wrote about Mark. Asterisk, my grandson has his father's ambition, but twice his impatience. He is a shark in a tailored suit, always moving, always hunting. I fear he will spend his whole life chasing the horizon, never realizing he is running on a treadmill of his own making. Asterisk, the words were sharp but not cruel. They were honest and they resonated with a truth I had felt my entire life but had never been able to articulate. Reading them felt like my grandfather was in the room with me, placing a steadying hand on my shoulder. Then I got to the list. Page after page of detailed, meticulously recorded assets. There were stock portfolios with blue-chip companies, but also significant holdings in small, innovative green tech startups he must have invested in decades ago. There were properties. A villa in Tuscany, a brownstone in New York, a sprawling ranch in Montana. There was an art collection that would make a museum curator weep, filled with pieces he had acquired on his travels, not for their fame but for their story. The numbers were staggering. It was more than millions. It was a legacy. My hands were trembling as I scrolled through the pages, my mind struggling to comprehend the sheer scale of it. My family had been right about one thing. The stakes were immense. As I reached the final page, my heart was pounding. I expected a concluding sentence, a final signature. But there was one last paragraph. It was short, dense, and written with a formality that stood in stark contrast to the personal tone of the preceding pages. I read it once, my brow furrowed in concentration. Then I read it again, the words beginning to sink in. A slow, spreading shock radiated through me, a current of electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. I pushed my chair back from the desk and stood up, walking to the window and looking out at the city lights. I saw my reflection in the dark glass, a pale, wide-eyed young woman. But I felt like a giant. My grandfather, the magnificent, eccentric, brilliant man. He hadn't just left behind a fortune. He had left behind a key. And then he had built a lock that only I could open. It wasn't a test. It was a coronation. The meeting was set for the following Monday. At Mark's insistence, it was to be held in a boardroom at his investment firm. The location was a power play designed to put me back in my place. It was a room built to intimidate, a sterile cage of glass and chrome high above the city, with a panoramic view of the financial district. It was their territory, a temple dedicated to the very values they held sacred. They were all there when I arrived. My father, my mother, and Mark, seated together on one side of a vast polished granite table. Mr. Henderson sat at one end, a neutral party, his worn leather briefcase beside him. They had the air of a parole board waiting to pass judgment. My mother gave me a tight, appraising look, her eyes scanning my outfit. In the past, I would have shown up in my usual uniform of worn jeans and a comfortable sweater. But not today. I had spent the weekend preparing. I had used the last of my savings to buy a simple, beautifully tailored dark blue dress, elegant and professional. My hair was pulled back neatly and I wore the only piece of expensive jewelry I owned, a small silver locket my grandfather had given me. I walked in, my heels clicking softly on the marble floor, and instead of taking one of the chairs on the side, I walked to the head of the table directly opposite Mr. Henderson and sat down. The move was subtle, but it shifted the dynamics of the room instantly. I was no longer the petitioner. I was presiding. Mark cleared his throat, impatient. "All right, Anya. You said you could read it. Let's get on with it. We don't have all day." He gestured to the projector screen at the end of the room, where a scan of the first page was displayed. I ignored him and placed my own printed, annotated translation on the table in front of me. "There's no need for the screen," I said, my voice calm and even. "I've completed the full translation." I looked at each of them in turn. My father, his face a mask of stern impatience. My mother, radiating a nervous, brittle energy. My brother, his arrogance barely concealing his anxiety. "Before we get to the financial disclosures," I began, "you should know that the first part of the text isn't a list of assets. It's more of a personal reflection. From grandfather." I saw a flicker of annoyance in my father's eyes. This was not part of the plan. They wanted numbers, not sentiment. I began to read, my voice filling the silent, sterile room. I read my grandfather's words about my father, about his sadness that his son had built a world of numbers and forgotten the poetry. I watched my father's jaw tighten, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He stared at the polished surface of the table, refusing to look at me. I continued, translating the passage about Mark, the shark in the tailored suit, forever chasing a horizon he could never reach. Mark for the first time looked unsettled. He shifted in his expensive chair, his usual smirk replaced by a guarded, hostile glare. "Is this necessary?" he snapped. "We're not here for a therapy session. Get to the point." "This is the point," I replied, my gaze unwavering. "Grandfather wanted you to hear this." The air in the room grew thick and heavy. I had seized control and they didn't know how to react. They were used to being the ones who set the terms, who controlled the narrative. Now they were captives to the words of a dead man, delivered by the one person they had never taken seriously. I turned the page of my translation. Now for the assets. Suddenly the mood shifted. Their irritation was replaced by a raw, naked greed. I watched as their eyes lit up, their postures changing as they leaned forward, hungry for the details. I began to list them, my voice a steady, dispassionate metronome. I read out the stock tickers and the number of shares. I detailed the locations and appraised values of the properties. The Tuscan villa, the New York brownstone, the Montana ranch. I described the key pieces in the art collection. A small, unsigned sketch later attributed to a Renaissance master, a series of early indigenous American pottery. With every word, their excitement grew more palpable. My mother let out a small, involuntary gasp when I mentioned the villa. My father and Mark began whispering to each other, quick, urgent calculations about capital gains tax and liquidation strategies. They had already forgotten the man who had built this fortune. They had forgotten his words, his warnings. They were already carving up the spoils. I let them have their moment. I let them swim in their fantasy of wealth, of victory. I continued reading, my voice a calm drone, until I reached the very last page. I paused. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the building's ventilation. All eyes were on me, waiting for the final tally, the grand total. I took a slow, deliberate breath. "There is one final clause," I said, looking up from the page and meeting Mr. Henderson's gaze. It concerns the administration of the estate. Mark waved a dismissive hand. Yes, the executor. I assume that's you, Mr. Henderson, or my father. Let's get to it. I held up a hand. Let me read it exactly as he wrote it. I focused on the page, though I already knew the words by heart. My voice was clear and precise, each word a carefully placed stone building a new reality. The entirety of this fortune, all assets listed herein and any others discovered henceforth, to be managed and disbursed for the benefit of the family and for the philanthropic endeavors I have outlined, shall be placed under the sole and absolute control of the executor of my estate. Mark smirked, a triumphant, knowing look he shared with my father. He thought he knew what was coming. He was wrong. I continued, my eyes lifting from the page to look directly at him, my voice ringing with a clarity that seemed to shake the very glass of the room. The appointed executor must be, as a demonstration of their understanding of those things I hold truly valuable, fully and fluently proficient in the dialect of the Val d'Aran as it is written in this journal. They must be able to read, write, and converse in it, and must prove this fluency to the complete and total satisfaction of my legal counsel. A silence fell over the room. It was not a quiet silence. It was a deafening, crushing void, a vacuum where all the air, all the arrogance, all the smug certainty had been violently sucked out. My mother's perfectly lipsticked mouth fell open in a silent, "Oh." My father, who had been leaning forward with such eager anticipation, seemed to shrink back into his chair, his face turning a pasty ashen white. Mark just stared at me. His face was a frozen mask of disbelief, his mind, so quick with numbers and strategies, utterly failing to process what he had just heard. The smirk was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed incomprehension. The silence stretched for 5, 10, 15 seconds. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. Finally, Mr. Henderson, the lawyer, broke the spell. He had been looking back and forth between the document and me, a slow, wonderful smile spreading across his face. He understood. He had known my grandfather for 50 years. He understood the old man's genius, his love of poetic justice. He turned to me, his eyes twinkling. "Miss Anya," he said, his voice formal but warm. "Your grandfather, in a separate sealed letter delivered to my office upon his passing, included a series of questions for me to ask the potential executor, to verify their fluency." He cleared his throat and spoke, his pronunciation accented but clear, a sentence in the old dialect. Asterisk, the old man asks if the falcon remembers the sky. Asterisk, it was a line from the troubadour's journal, a metaphor for never forgetting where you come from. Without hesitation I replied in the same flowing tongue. Asterisk, the falcon remembers the sky, the river remembers the sea, and a granddaughter remembers the man who gave her wings. Asterisk, Mr. Henderson beamed. He slammed his hand down on the table, a gesture of finality and delight. "It is settled. The conditions of the will are met. The estate is now under the sole executorship of Miss Anya." For a moment there was still just the frozen shock. Then the dam broke. "No!" Mark shouted, bolting to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "No. This is insane. He's lying. She made it up." He pointed a trembling finger at me, his face contorted with rage. "She manipulated the translation. There's no way this is real." "I assure you, Mr. Mark, it is very real," Mr. Henderson said calmly, holding up the handwritten pages. "Arthur's handwriting is unmistakable and the clause is right here. I am legally bound to enforce it." My father finally found his voice, a strangled, pleading sound. "Anya, this can't be right. There must be a mistake. This is family money." My mother, recovering from her initial shock, switched tactics. Her face softened into a grotesque mask of maternal affection. "Anya, darling," she cooed, starting to rise from her chair as if to come to me. "We always knew how clever you were. Your grandfather clearly saw your unique talents. We're a team, all of us. We can manage this together." The speed of their transformation was breathtaking. One moment I was a worthless disappointment, the next I was the brilliant, talented gatekeeper to their future. The hypocrisy was so potent it was almost dizzying. I looked at them, my brother sputtering with rage, my father pale with desperation, my mother dripping with false sincerity, and I felt nothing but a profound, cold calm. The years of hurt, of seeking their approval, had evaporated in the heat of this moment. I no longer needed them to see my worth. I knew it. And more importantly, I now controlled it. I stood up, my movements slow and deliberate. I gathered my translated papers, tapping them into a neat stack on the table. For years, I said, my voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, the three of you have made it abundantly clear what you think of me. You have told me in 1,000 different ways that my life's passion was a worthless hobby. You have mocked me, you have dismissed me, and you have made me feel like nothing. I looked at my mother. You called my work a little hobby just last week. I looked at my brother. You asked if my plan was to talk to ghosts. I looked at my father. You used my heart's work as a coaster. I let the words hang in the air, each one a small, sharp indictment. The estate is now under my management. As executor, my first duty is to my grandfather's wishes, not your desires. I will need time to perform a full and thorough audit of all assets. I will need to consult with financial advisors and philanthropic experts to create a plan for its equitable distribution. I picked up my purse and my papers. I will be in touch through Mr. Henderson when I have made my decisions. This meeting is over. I turned and walked toward the door, my back straight, my head held high. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I could feel their stunned, powerless silence follow me all the way out of the room, through the opulent lobby, and out into the bright, clear air of the city. For the first time in my life, I felt completely and utterly free. The 6 months that followed were a blur of activity and transformation. I stepped out of the shadow of my family and into a life of my own design. The first thing I did was quit my job as a barista. My second was to establish the Arthur Vance Foundation for the Preservation of Endangered Languages. Using a portion of the estate's initial funds, I created grants for academics, field researchers, and communities working to document and revitalize the world's linguistic heritage. I traveled. I went to the Andes to meet with elders who were the last speakers of a dialect of Quechua. I went to Siberia to help fund a project creating a digital archive of Ket oral histories. I was no longer just studying the past, I was helping to preserve it for the future. I was living my grandfather's legacy, using the fortune he had built not as a monument to wealth, in which my family would have reveled, but as a tool for connection and understanding. My family, meanwhile, was forced to adapt to a new reality. Their reaction was, predictably, a mix of clumsy contrition and subtle manipulation. My mother started calling me every day, her conversations filled with cloying compliments and casual suggestions about investment opportunities for the family fund. I kept the calls brief and polite. My father attempted a more stoic approach, sending me awkward emails with links to financial articles, as if to prove his utility. I thanked him for the information and filed it away. Mark was the most difficult. After 2 weeks of sullen silence, he showed up at my new apartment. A modest but comfortable place I'd bought in a quiet neighborhood. He tried to apologize, but it came out as a bitter, resentful mess about how much pressure he'd been under. I listened patiently, and when he was done, I laid out the new terms of our relationship. I established a comfortable but not extravagant monthly allowance for my parents, enough to cover their expenses and maintain their home, but not enough to fund their previous lifestyle of lavish excess. I made the allowance contingent on one thing. They had to attend family therapy sessions with me. At first they balked, but the thought of being cut off entirely was a powerful motivator. For Mark, I took a different approach. I cut him off financially, completely. "You are smart and capable," I told him, sitting across from him in my new living room. "You've always been proud of your ability to make money. So go make your own. The estate will not be your safety net." I saw the fury flash in his eyes, but I continued. "However, the foundation will pay for a career counselor or for tuition if you decide you want to study something new, something that actually brings you fulfillment instead of just a paycheck. The choice is yours." He stormed out, of course, but the offer stood. It was my way of honoring my grandfather's words. I wouldn't give them what they wanted, but I would give them what I believed they needed. A chance to find a different kind of value. The power dynamic had been permanently, irrevocably inverted. I was no longer the family disappointment seeking their approval. I was the matriarch, the benefactor, setting the terms of their existence, and I was doing it with a calm resolve that surprised even myself. Looking back on it all now, I realized the most valuable thing my grandfather left me wasn't the money. It wasn't the properties or the power. It was the proof of a lesson he had been teaching me my whole life, that worth is not determined by the approval of others. My passion for dead languages, the very thing my family had used as a weapon to make me feel small and useless, turned out to be the key to everything. It was the one thing they couldn't buy, couldn't bully, and couldn't comprehend. Their narrow definition of value became their prison, and my broad, impractical one became my liberation. The greatest fortune I inherited was the quiet confidence that comes from knowing who you are, and from honoring the passions that make you unique. The money simply gave me the platform to live that truth out loud. And that's my story. It's a story about family and value, and the surprising ways that the universe can deliver justice. Thank you so much for listening and for joining me today. I want to hear from you now. Have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever had a skill or a passion that others dismissed, only to have it become your greatest asset? Share your story in the comments below. I read as many as I can, and I believe our stories have power when we share them. If this video resonated with you, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories about finding strength in unexpected places. Remember, your value is inherent. It exists independently of anyone else's ability to see it. Sometimes the world just needs a little time to catch up. Thank you again for being here. I wish you all the best.